mean, I've used cars. I've had used cars long enough to know this. I had a Sunbeam Talbot once. Back in the 60s, I had an old Sunbeam Talbot, which was a wonderful four-seater convertible made in England, which, as everybody knows, is that you're looking for trouble with an English car. And this one is not only trouble; it had its gear shift in backwards. So what looked like first gear was reverse. And I realized it had the great advantage it could never be stolen in the street. Because if you broke into the car and started it up and put it into first, it slammed into the car behind you and panicked you to all hell. And so this was a kind of unstealable car. Now, I don't know why they did this thing, but I never wanted to change it because I was so happy with the car that started with the gear shift in a different place that I got used to the car. Which I think is often what you have to do is you have to adapt to something rather than adapt it to you. But it depends on, I don't mind adapting to certain things. So, in any case, I think I address it in this case that I respect Jerry's interest in the transcendental shaman, but to me it's goofy. And Jerry is very much like me in other ways. For example, the first talk piece I did in a poetry contest was a piece called "What Am I Doing Here?" Because I came there with no books in my hands, and it was the San Francisco Poetry Center. I came there without a book in my hands. Jerry and I were reading at the same reading. He was reading first, and I was reading second. And Kathy Fraser introduced us in this rather comical way in which Jerry was being described as the poet of the great past and the great tradition of the past tradition I had been undiscovered. And I was the future. The futuristic virtue, which I don't know if it really added up to anything, but the first thing happened is I posed to ask the question, what am I doing here? And it was a literal question because I didn't bring any books. How can you do a reading without books? The answer is you can talk. You can think out loud, which is a little dangerous. But the one thing I wanted to talk about that was that Jerry also has a line in Cockboy, one of his funny poems, in which he says, somebody says, "What am I doing here?" Cowboy is giving us Cockboy, and he says, "What am I doing here?" And I'm saying, and on my piece says, "What am I doing here?" And Jerry is mimicking some rabbinical East Side figure talking about his visions as possibly a fur trapper and adapting to the Indians of the far West. Whereas all I'm doing is saying, what am I doing here? I'm surrounded by these native poets who write in the native language of poetry, when I basically compose without the native language of poetry. I compose in the poetry of the street. And I identify with writers like Prévert and Villon and Eustache Deschamps. I have a French bias, but, well, you know, Rabelais, Montaigne, are poets whose work I basically find very appealing, and it's the thieves' argot of you know, that I like. It's the mock scholarliness of Rabelais with his sort of hysterical hyperbolic style, or Montaigne's uncertainty. I mean, Montaigne, I always said that Montaigne is literally one of the missing links in the history of the great eccentrics of postmodernism. He stands somewhere before Kierkegaard and after Socrates, and it seems to me that it goes through a variety of people, but I'm interested essentially in the secular, the vernacular, as probing from a secular point of view, like the Rothko Chapel story is essentially an analysis of the existential problematics of the Rothko Chapel. It's totally conducted in what I would call the mixed high vernacular. It's the vernacular in which people think. It's not the vernacular of like a street hustler, but if I chose to do that at some point, it would be only to give a sample of it. I wouldn't regard that as mine either. I talk my own dialect here on my own idiolect, which is probably enough like most other New Yorkers of my generation, especially the ones who have been reasonably educated. Like my accent is not normally described as a classical New York accent. for reasons I'm not sure of. I think because they imagine that New York accent as being always illiterate and always incapable of intellectualism. So you used to have in the old days Jewish scholars avoiding their home dialect, but with a fake English dialect. When I first got at the University of California, San Diego, all the assistant professors spoke as if they had learned to be British. And it was very funny, because they really, you know, we've done graduate work in linguistics, and I would sit down and do the phonological analysis of their speech, which was really kind of absurd. They would have the most insane pronunciations, a little bit, and it was a little bit like the story told me by my phonology professor, a man named Hubble, an old, clever old guy, and he said, when he was a graduate student in Columbia, they had a poet coming to read, and he was the person sent to tape record, to wire record the proceedings, and they had this guy there. He said he came in, and he said, and he read something like this: "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land." You know, and he said this guy didn't know what language he was speaking. And I said, you're probably right. He didn't. I thought he was an Englishman, and they didn't believe him. But the academic discourse of young historians was probably contaminated by this idea of British correctitude. Whereas we could have corrected the British by New York correctitude, and it would have been just as silly.
Was your French, when you spoke about your French bias, was that similar to Frank O'Hara's, John Ashbery's French bias?
I'm sorry.
When you spoke about your French bias, your liking for French poets, was that also a way not to like British literature? Was that a way to look for another tradition in letters?
Well, I think the point is this, that I have always liked certain English poets, like Geoffrey Chaucer. And I thought Chaucer was the master of a great vernacular. And I love D.H. Lawrence. I love Lawrence's poetry. And Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins. You know, I also like the kind of deadly satirical style of Alexander Pope. You know, I am someone says, not as his dog at Q, pray tell me, sir, whose dog are you? You know, I like, again, I have a taste for the value, and there are certainly English poets I like, but the English poets who dominated the Brit scene were in fact the most dismal academics I had ever encountered. So it wasn't, whereas whether you were reading Mallarmé or Rimbaud, you didn't have to make excuses for what they were saying, or how they said it. I mean, it was even like reading a crackpot fascist nut like Céline, the prose crackles. I mean, there's an energy there that is admirable and free of academic constraint. Now, he, of course, was probably half insane, but that gave him an edge that was more interesting than reading Philip Larkin. I mean, when somebody says Philip Larkin, I fall asleep. Tom Gunn. I mean, Seamus Heaney. These are the names of illustrious foreigners I can't bear. Besides which, who needs to translate Beowulf? Read goddamn Beowulf without translation. Well, you can't get close to Beowulf. It really doesn't work. I mean, it's a cultural space you can't occupy, really, and you have to treat it as an exoticism and deal somehow with its brilliance of what it is in a way that they don't do. I mean, like, how can somebody like a Brit 20th century poet produce a sound that makes sense out of that Anglo-Saxon material? The answer is they can't, and they don't. They produce an absurd, banal alternate. Whereas Chaucer, if you wanted to, as it were, do Chaucer in an English colloquial, you could do it very simply, because it's a highly elegant vernacular. Homer is a complicated story, but no British poet ever sounds like Homer. Thank God. Which is a name I take in vain. No, I actually had deep affection for for the German tradition also. That is, I grew up on German poetry as well. And, you know, like Kafka, I consider Kafka a poet. You know, Kafka and Morgenstern are two of my favorite poets that are German. Rilke was, as far as the Book of Images goes, though I detest the Duino elegies as transcendental garbage. Well, I have a new essay coming out in Critical Inquiry. It's an essay, or either that, it's an essay or a talk piece, because it's both. And it's called Hiccups. And it's an attack on Levinas and Blanchot's approach to poetics, in which I point out that what they admire is always the same thing. That is, they always admire the certain kind of extreme of transcendentalism. You have Hölderlin as their example, who's a wonderful poet, but a crazed poet. And they always cite Hölderlin, Rilke, and Kafka, and sometimes some other poet, I'm not sure who. And I remember when I did the piece, I remembered who it was. But there was a line in a New Yorker of a poem about John Ashbery, who seems to become the magazine poet of the New Yorker. And it was kind of average Ashbery poem, which was all right, but it wasn't distinguished. But there was one line that caught me. It says, when you have hiccups, it's always different. And it occurred to me that these theorists never take up the issue of the poem that's built on that idea. You know, and they're never capable of dealing with it. Like Lana Turner, get up. You know, but no, they want something like, every single angel is terrible. Or like, who if I cried out would hear me among the angelic orders? The answer is no one.